You're listening to Navigating the French on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content and a bonus episode of Navigating the French, please join us on Patreon.
Hello, and welcome to Navigating the French, the podcast where each episode we take a look at a French word and try and see what it tells us about French culture. I'm your host, Emily Monaco. Today I'm joined by Jennifer Greco, a cheese educator and an American expat on a mission to taste each and every one of France's cheeses. She's here to chat about a very cheesy word that gives us a hint at the complexity of cheese making, aging, and more. Affineur. Welcome, Jennifer, to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited to have you here. We have a shared love of all things cheese.
Yes.
So for those out there who aren't familiar with you and your work, which if you're a cheese fan, you really should be, can you tell us a little bit about sort of who you are and what you do here in Paris?
Okay, yes. So thank you again for having me. We've been trying to get this recorded for a while, so I'm really happy that we're finally doing this. I've been in France for just over 20 years, and I've had a personal project for the last 16 years or so to try to taste every cheese made in France, which started as on a whim as a simple thing. I thought there were maybe 400 or so, and I've had a blog for about 18 years, and I thought it'd be fun material to write about. Turns out I was very off on my figures, so I'm still working away at this little project. Getting close to 500 now, but yeah, it's this thing that's kind of taken over my life, and I just think it's so fascinating, and I love it. So I'm a French cheese kind of, as you are too, kind of nerd, a lover, just and a wonderful subject. It's kind of like studying wine, I guess. It's never ending.
Yeah, and you're an educator here in Paris.
Yes.
Jennifer runs amazing cheese tastings. So if you are a fellow cheese nerd and you want to learn even more, especially after listening to this podcast, if you're drooling, we will put a link to Jennifer's cheese tastings in the show notes. But I mean, cheese is such an interesting element of, you know, the French terroir, French gastronomic landscape. So you said originally when you started this project to try them all, you thought there were about 400.
Right.
Do you know how many there actually are?
Well, it's funny because there's different sites who have different numbers. So I've read anywhere between 1,200 to 1,400 to 1,600 to 1,800. And then there's another website who claims they have identified about 2,000 just raw milk cheeses in France. So I kind of tell people there's between like 1,500 to 2,000. So
that's a lot of cheese.
Yeah, I don't think anyone really. Cheeses are still being created. I remember a new one was created last year, a goat cheese. Others disappear. One of my favorite cheeses that was made by a couple down in a region you know well, the Corbière.
Mm-hmm.
The couple who had this small sheep farm and made a few sheep milk cheeses retired, and nobody bought their farm. So those few cheeses that they made locally and sold at local markets, they are gone. They disappeared because the people who made them are no longer doing that. So it's constantly changing. As you probably know, you go to fromageries here in the city and you're like, oh, there's a new cheese. And where did that come from? And so it's a constantly changing landscape, I guess.
Totally. And yet I'm curious because obviously you've been working your way around at this for a long time, but there are cheeses that pop up again and again and again. And then there are cheeses that are a lot rarer.
Right.
When you walk into your average French fromagerie, how many of those cheeses would you guess that you sort of recognize? Like, what are the ones that are kind of frequent flyers, and how often do you encounter one that you've never seen before?
Oh, normally if I go into a French cheese shop in Paris, I will have tasted everything that they have. You know, there's the big names like Comté, Roquefort, Saint-Nectaire, one of my personal favorites, Époisse, Camembert, Brie. Usually those are the ones that are always there. And it's more the small sheep milk producers, sheep farms in the Pyrenees, or goat cheeses. I feel like those are the ones that new goat cheeses show up more often than other cheeses. So it's rare that I walk into a cheese shop here in the city and find something new. It happens once every 3 to 4 months, I'd say. I did get a new one last week, so that was exciting.
Oh, what was that?
Well, it's funny. There's a farm just outside of Paris, La Ferme de la Tremblay. You know of it, I'm sure.
Yeah, yeah.
So they're organic. They grow all of the food for the animals. They do goat and cow. They don't have sheep. And everything is all done on site. And they do some really nice cheeses. They're all pasteurized, which is not something I usually go for, but their cheeses are really, really delicious. And I met the guy who works there at I think it was the Salon de Fromage in 2021. But yeah, their products are delicious. So like they do a camembert, which isn't camembert de Normandie because they're not in Normandy. They don't have the right to use that term, but they make they have a really delicious goat cheese blue. Yeah. So I'm enjoying their things.
That's super cool. And so, okay, we're already nerding out on this.
Yeah,
Let's
I know.
zoom out for a second because you brushed up against something that I think is really important for people to understand when we're talking about French cheese. You know, when you were saying, oh, it's not a camembert de Normandie because it's Normandy. So many, most I would say, and maybe I'm completely wrong, but most French cheeses are named after a place, right? Where they get their names from.
Yeah. So, I mean, really, there's only 46 cheeses that are protected. You know, we have these protection rules in France, just like Italy does, like Spain does. In France, it's called AOC, or there's now the AOP, which is the more European wide. But only 46 of them are protected. So it started with Roquefort. And so names like Comté, Beaufort, Camembert de Normandie. So you have a cheese called Camembert de Normandie. You cut off the de Normandie from Normandy, and you just call it Camembert, and you can do whatever you want. You can make it in, Texas with yak milk. It doesn't matter, but there are these names that are very protected. Just like, and most people know about this related to wine. Champagne is a great example, or Côte du Rhône, Sancerre, Châteauneuf-du-Pape was the first wine to ever get this protection. So there are certain cheeses when you go into a cheese shop, really anywhere, and you buy a Comté cheese, it is made in the Franche-Comté with certain breeds of cow milk, made in a certain way, and that will always be the same wherever you buy it. If you're in Australia or Canada or the States, it will be that cheese. So just like Roquefort as well. Roquefort has to be made in a certain region, aged in certain caves. So
yeah, and like you know this, but there's some that are pretty loosey-goosey and some that are like only this cow that was born in this region. Yeah.
Yeah, eating the flowers at this elevation for this month of the year. Yes, it does get very, very, very particular, which is super cool because when you're buying that product, you kind of know what you're getting.
Right.
Yes, when you buy a Comté, depending on what age it is, but you really know what the flavor profile will be.
Yeah, and you and I have spoken about this before, and I remember you saying, I really liked the way that you phrased this, which is that when you look for an AOP cheese or an AOC cheese, you're not necessarily looking for it as a mark of quality, you're looking for it as a mark of consistency.
Yes, yeah. So in the wine world, you'd say typicity, but year after year after year, they're kind of protecting the consumer as well. These people are being inspected and they're controlled what they're producing. And so we, as the consumer, know what we're buying. And they're protecting those age-old traditions, which I think is super cool.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of what's so fun and so nerdy about this too, is like, I mean, I know you've been up into the Comté region and seen the way that they make and age Comté, and it's time tested, right? It's holding generations of tradition.
Yes, absolutely.
So, okay. So speaking of Comté, when I invited you onto this podcast, I was trying to think of the word that we were going to talk about. And the first word that came to mind was fromage. And then I kind of went a little bit rogue and thought, actually, One of the words that I'm interested in talking to you about is a word that really doesn't translate very well into English, and that's the word affineur. So can you tell me like the big bones differences between like what's a fromager and what's an affineur?
Oh, okay. So the fromager, it can be both the person making a cheese or the person selling the cheese. But an affineur is someone who is ripening, aging, maturing, like taking that cheese when it's young and ripening it to its perfect state before you're passing it on to the consumer. So it is a really important step. Not all cheesemongers are affineurs. There's not that many of them because you do have to have people who are skilled in affinage. It's a more scientific aspect of cheese. So you have to have dedicated space, which is in the city is kind of expensive. So there's not a lot of fromager affineur, but the affineur for a lot of people who are making cheese, they don't have the time and or the space to do that. So they will pass their cheeses off to these dedicated cheese finishing schools, for lack of a better term. But these are people who have more of a scientific, they know about the molds, the yeasts, the microbes, and they have to be very physical with the cheeses. They're very hands-on, turning, brushing, washing cheeses. So it's a super interesting aspect of the cheese world. A lot of like the goat cheesemakers, goat cheeses are really young when we eat them, so they don't really require a lot of this cheese aging. But cheese like a Comté, which can be aged for up to 5 years, you have to have someone who is physically taking care of that cheese for a long time. And they have to know exactly what to do to get it to the best that it can be, if that makes sense.
Well, that makes total sense. And I think Comté is such an interesting example. Like if you were to compare your little tiny sheep's milk cheese that the people in the Corbière used to make versus the Comté world, like there's so many more people involved in Comté, right? Because Comté is France's most popular, biggest produced cheese.
Iconic.
Totally iconic. What makes the production of Comté and the aging of Comté stand out as compared to like your run of the mill little goat or sheep cheese?
Oh, yeah. So they're made, well, it's only made in the Franche-Comté region. So that's the Jura. And they're made in cooperatives. So they're not made on farms. You're never going to find a farm Comté because it takes the daily milk of 25 plus cows, like 25 to 30 cows to make one wheel. The wheels are about 90 pounds. So every day, these cooperatives, it's funny because the numbers on the Comté website, when you look at the French one versus the English one, the French say there's only 140. The US or English, excuse me, version says there's 153.
Oh,
So
wow.
I know, like, I don't know who's editing that, but so these small cooperatives are taking the milk of the cows. It's mainly the milk of the Montbéliard cow, and they're creating these cheeses. So each cow is supposed to have about 2.5 acres, so 1 hectare of land for grazing. So each cooperative, if the cooperative only owns like 10 hectares, which is a hectare is 2.5 acres, they can only really own 10 cows. So it takes a lot more milk to make one wheel. So they can buy milk, but the milk has to come from farms within an 8-mile radius of the cooperative. So you actually know what the cows are eating, where they're grazing. It's all right there. It's done very quickly. Like the milk comes in and they're making the cheese very soon after they're milking the cows. So you really know how the cows are treated. They're healthy. It's hard to explain, but when you talk about the milk, the diet is super important. The health of the animal is very important. When you're talking about big mass industrial dairy, it doesn't matter as much because they're buying milk from all over and pooling it together. And when you're pasteurizing as well, you're losing a lot of the flavor that's connected to the place that the animals are eating. So Comté is one of these places where you're really connected to where the cows are, what they're eating, and you're tasting really their diet. It's the terroir. It's the idea that we talk about with wine of the grapes, where they're growing, the soil, the weather, and cheese also has terroir. So it's very connected to the place. And when you're pasteurizing milk, so Comté is not pasteurized, you really sever that connection. So it's very connected to the Comté region.
If you're enjoying this podcast, you may enjoy our sister podcast, Molly on a Trip, Music Around Paris, which is brand new to the Paris Underground Radio Network. Music industry expat Molly Lehman has moved to Paris and taken her love of music with her. Each episode, Molly sits down with local French artists or touring musicians from all over the world to talk about what's going on in their careers and what inspires them. Get insights on what these musicians love most about Paris. Check out Molly on a Trip, Music Around Paris now, available wherever you listen to podcasts. Navigating the French will be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French. I think that idea of terroir being linked to the flavor of cheese was evoked in what you were saying about Camembert. Like, you know, as soon as you take Camembert out of Normandy,
yes,
it's a different cheese.
It's a different cheese.
So I think probably as a cheese educator, you get asked a lot about sort of the way that French, well, first of all, I get the slightly annoying question sometimes of people asking, well, how do they eat so much cheese and stay so thin? And I mean, I don't think we need to necessarily, they have good cholesterol. It's magic.
Yes, it's magic. Yeah.
But the French don't eat cheese the way that Americans eat cheese, I think is safe to say. So how do French people eat cheese? What stands out about their approach as compared to the way Americans do?
So, yeah, the French consume about almost 60 pounds of cheese on average per year. And in America, and it's actually gone up in the last 23 years from 30 pounds a year to 40 pounds.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I know. I was shocked when I did a little research on that. It's enjoyed as a course in the dining, not as more of a snacky food, but as something you have between the main course and dessert. So it's a separate course. It tends to just be cheese, bread, and wine. There's not all the fruits and jams and things around it. And it's very, I feel, moderate. It's just a little bit. You have a couple slices of a few different things, and that's it. It's not these very elaborate cheese boards with chocolate covered pretzels and gummy bears.
Yeah.
The things you see on Instagram. So yeah, it's just something that's enjoyed as part of the meal. Also, they have always believed here that eating cheese, unpasteurized cheese, does help you aid in your digestion. And there have been studies that prove eating small amounts and mainly hard cheeses like a Comté, Gruyere, Parmigiano Reggiano, those cheeses have enzymes that do help with your digestion. They do help you digest your food. So
that's a good reason for me.
Yeah, I know. It's like, eat your cheese. Eat your greens, but eat your cheese.
But the French do love talking about their digestion. Just
I know. It's true. It's true. Any visit to the pharmacy will tell you that's very true, because there's lots of adverts for digestion things.
So if you were, let's say you went to a French friend's house and there was a cheese course, how many cheeses would you expect to see on the board? And how many, would you try all of them? Would you try a big piece of all of them? How would you kind of approach a cheese board if you were a guest in somebody's home?
Oh, yeah. Usually there's 3 to 5, depending on how big the group is. Obviously, if it's a huge gathering and there's going to be more, but I would personally probably try to take a small slice of each one to try. I think you should at least try a couple, but just small portions, not humongous chunks, because by that point you've probably already had a starter and a main course and dessert is coming. So it's a moderate amount of, I would say, each one. I don't know. Would you do the same? Would you take one of each?
I take a little bit of each, but also I feel like a lot of people won't take some of everything. I mean, I want to, so I do it. But I also feel like I've definitely noticed when I go to French people's homes, some people will only take 1 or 2.
Oh, really?
But I mean, that's why I was curious, because I don't know if that's just my weird microcosm of cheese agnostic French people? Because some people get really excited about it. Like you and I get really excited about it, and I could just have cheese for dinner. But
I know.
And do you feel like you see more often people putting out like knives for each of the cheeses, or do you like use your own knife? Like what's the protocol for that?
Good question. I feel like it's just one knife for all the cheese, which I am not a fan of, I have to say, because some are stronger than others. And if you take a knife that's been in a Roquefort or a heavy wash rind or blue cheese and take that knife and put it into like a fresh little goat cheese, it will have all of the stinky or strong cheese kind of still clinging to it. So I personally have a rule about blue cheese. If I'm serving a blue, it gets its own plate or board and its own knife. And you shall not use that knife to cut other cheeses. So it's one of my little personal rules that you should make sure the mild cheeses are not being affected by the stronger ones with the same knife.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But that's my own thing.
Well, but I mean, it makes sense as a thing. I learned recently that goat cheese has very different microbes on it than other cheeses. And so you should really keep it not only in its own paper, but like in its own bit of the fridge.
Right. Yes.
Keep them separate.
Yeah, it's true.
Well, there we go. And like, okay, so these days, the approach to French dining is changing. Like, I've talked about this with other folks on the podcast, and there are some people who are starting to skip the cheese course a little bit, which is like shock and horror. I know Nicolas Sarkozy took the cheese course out of the French like official state lunch when he was president.
Oh my.
Blasphemy, awful. But like, there's also kind of, we see all these cheese and charcuterie boards that you alluded to earlier with, you know, that we see on Instagram and in the States. And French people are doing a little more of the like whole apéro dînatoire kind of thing where they eat heavy hors d'oeuvres instead of a meal. How are you seeing cheese? Like when you're just with your friends, whether they're French or American, like do you see cheese as being still the cheese course? Do you see it more as an appetizer or people cooking with it? Like what's exciting you about the way that people are enjoying cheese in France today?
Well, I feel like people are much more excited in the wintertime with the raclette and the Mont d'Or. I think raclette sales during our pandemic lockdown soared like they went up 15% or something. Raclette machines sold out. No one could get one because we were all sitting around eating cheese. Most of the parties or things I go to, if it's an apéro dînatoire kind of thing, there is cheese. It feels like it's still just cheese on a board on its own, not mixed with other things. So people will nibble on it, but not mixing it with meats or other things. And then dinners, I feel like especially on a good long Sunday lunch, there's always a cheese board coming. At restaurants, it feels like it's more of an option between cheese or dessert instead of both. And usually it will be one cheese, maybe a couple, but it doesn't feel like you get the option of a cheese course. Do you know what I mean? Like several cheeses on a board coming. It feels like it's just one cheese, a standalone kind of thing with maybe some jam or some fruit or different bread or a drizzle of something, which is fine. I still tend to be more of a classic, just give me the cheese. I don't want to mess with it too much. So I do think it's changed. I'm not a young person, so I don't know what the young people are doing at home. But in the country, when I go out to the country with families, I feel like there's still a cheese course. It's still pretty classic.
Yeah, and I would agree with you. I think it's more of a Paris thing than a countryside thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it is interesting to see the cheese course in a restaurant, like you said, instead of being like a cheese cart, there's often like one or maybe like a choice between two, but you don't get two on a plate.
Right. It tends to just be one single thing, which is weird in a way to me. Again, and they seem to be the same cheese always. It's like
30-month Comté.
Yeah, Comté, or it just there doesn't seem to be a lot of variation or something interesting.
Yeah.
So I tend not to do that because I don't need to spend that much money on a cheese course if it's just Comté or Roquefort or things that you just get over and over. So it'd be nice if people were doing something interesting, small producer, rare cheeses, not just the same thing.
Or something, I mean, I don't know how you feel about these because that sort of plain cheese, a colleague of ours will call out Aurelian. I love the way he says it. He says, in France, we call it a cheese board because it's a board with cheese on it. Yeah, but there are some some agers, some cheesemongers like Laurent Dubois, like Nathalie Quatrum, like Pierre Coulon, who do a little bit of transformation, who like will coat a cheese in herbs or fill it with jam or something. That could be cool.
Yes, I think their creations are amazing, and they're almost like a pastry. They're like a beautiful pastry, but cheese. And those, I think, stand alone and should just be their own thing. Some of Laurent Dubois' creations are incredible. He has one that is, I think it's a camembert with sour cherries soaked in kirsch.
Oh my God.
Oh my God. Yeah. Incredible. So good. I got it last Valentine's Day and it was this amazing, like cherry boozy cheese, creamy. It was incredible. So those should stand alone.
Yes, the cheese stands alone.
The cheese stands alone.
We've gone through some of them, but are there any other kind of like misconceptions or things that you feel like a lot of Americans get wrong or misunderstand about French cheese?
Well, I feel like it's a subject people are kind of afraid of. They're interested in it, but they don't know how to navigate it. So they're worried that things will be too stinky, too strong. They don't know how to shop for cheeses. They go to their local store and just get the same thing over and over. So I just wish people would be a little more open to trying new things. And I know it's much more expensive in the US than it is here. We are very fortunate that our chunk of cheese is about half of what it costs in the US. But just to kind of, if people would get outside of their comfort zone and try new things, because and sometimes it can be super stinky, but just because it's really stinky doesn't mean the flavor is as strong as it smells. So just kind of step out of the comfort zone. It would be my wish for people. And also rely on the people selling. I know it's not like it is here. A lot of people aren't as educated, but let them help you find new things. Or if you really like one cheese in a certain style, like a hard pressed cheese, like a Comté, maybe try other cheeses in that same style just to kind of introduce yourselves to different flavors, different things. But I think that it's often the aromas that put people off. And if they understand that the smell doesn't always mean that the cheese is super strong in flavor, that could be helpful.
If you're enjoying this episode of Navigating the French, you may also be interested in our sister podcast, Storytime in Paris, where each week host Jennifer interviews a different author about his or her book set in Paris or France. Navigating the French will be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French. And I'm sure everybody is always asking you to choose a favorite.
Ugh.
Do you have, rather than pick a favorite, let's say you could make a board for someone who is super open-minded and they want to try 3 exciting French cheeses. What would you put on the board?
Oh, God. Okay, so I do have one that I totally love. I've served it to people. They're not as excited about it as I am, but it's a Corsican wash-rind cheese. That's a sheep cheese called Le Carré Corse. I found it, actually, if I had tasted it 10 years ago, I probably would not have liked it as much as I do now, but I found it very umami and the layers of flavor in it were incredible. I just loved it. So I would put that as a wild card because that one's a little bit of a stretch for most people. I do love goat cheese. We are in goat cheese season right now, and just all these beautiful fresh goat cheeses. Actually, it's funny. I hadn't had a Selle sur Cher, which is pretty classic goat cheese from the Loire, in years, I'd say. And I had one a couple weeks ago, and it was just so delicious. So I need to revisit classics like that. So a really nice ash-covered goat cheese would be there. The super stinky, funky carré course, and then I would probably throw in a cow's milk cheese. I do love abondance. So probably those three. I don't know about which goat cheese it would be. It would depend on where I was and who had good ash-covered goat cheese, but abondance and then le carré course. I would choose those three.
Amazing. I'm inviting myself over.
That's today. It would change tomorrow.
That's fair. Well, Jennifer, thank you so much for joining me and for taking us through the somewhat confounding but always delicious world of French cheese. Before I let you go, I have one last question for you. And that, what is your favorite word in French?
Oh, inoubliable.
Ooh.
It's like mouth candy.
And it means?
Unforgettable.
I love it.
Inoubliable. It's just such a great word.
Well, thank you so very much for joining me. Anyone who's tuning in who wants to learn more about French cheese from Jennifer, I will include links to her website where she is slowly but surely eating her way through France's 2,000 cheeses. And also the link to her cheese tastings, where if you're in Paris and you want to discover the world of French cheese, Jennifer will guide you through a consequential tasting of cheese paired with some lovely French wines.
Yes.
Thank you so much for joining me, and have a fantastic rest of your day.
Thanks, hon. I am so glad we finally got to talk.
Me too. This has been Navigating the French. You can find more from me, Emily Monaco, at Emily_in_France on Twitter and Instagram. This podcast is produced by Paris Underground Radio. To listen to other episodes of this podcast, or to discover more podcasts like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com. Thanks for listening, and à bientôt.
This episode of Navigating the French was produced by Jennifer Greco for Paris Underground Radio. For more great content, join us on Patreon at patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio.